I am 83 years old. I was married in the autumn of 1961 when I was 18 to a man 23 years old who would preach in our church for 50 years. And the man I married was chosen for me before anyone ever thought to tell me his name. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I have had 65 years to sit with it, and I am only now able to say it plainly. The match was not made by me. It was settled quietly in the understanding of the families when I was 17 and still kneeling at my baptism, a girl who believed her whole worth was her yieldedness. Among the plain people, a thing like that has a shape to it. The fathers speak. The ordained men nod. A girl is not asked whether she will. She is only watched to see that she does. And on the night that match became a marriage, in a plain bedroom on a farm near Georgetown, I did a thing I have never told a living soul. I will tell you, but not yet. First, you have to understand the silence I was raised inside. If this is reaching you, I would ask one thing of you tonight. Stay in the room with me. Not to be entertained. I have no cheerfulness to spare. Stay because somewhere there is a younger woman whose future was decided before she could read it, and she needs to know an old woman lived through it and can finally speak. Subscribe so the next one finds her way here. And tell me, in your own words, where you are listening from tonight, and whether you too were handed a life you were never asked to want. The dress was already hanging on a peg in my mother's room before I had been told the day was set. It was a dark dress, plain, the color of a wet field in November, sewn from cloth my mother and I had measured out together in the spring. And I remember running the back of my hand down it and feeling the seams and knowing, the way you know weather, that it was the dress they would marry me in. No one had said the word wedding to me, but the dress knew. The dress had been started before I was told. That is how it was done. The thing arrives in your life already built, and your part is only to step into it, the way you step into your shoes in the dark before the lamp is lit. I was a baptized member of the Jameh by then. I had knelt the summer before, 17 years old, and made the vow that joined me to the church and made me, though I did not understand it that way at 18, a person who could one day be put under the ban if I ever broke it. I thought I was promising myself to God. I understand now that I was also promising myself to a great machine that had already decided what a girl like me was for. The vow was real. The machine was also real. It took me a lifetime to learn that both of those things could be true at the same time. Eli's family farmed a few miles over in the same circuit of districts as my father, which is to say, our two families had sat on the same backless benches 3 hours at a stretch, the Lobley dragged out of the Ausbund a syllable at a time for as long as anyone could remember. I had seen him at the singings, a quiet boy, broad through the shoulders, the kind of young man the older men already spoke well of. I will not pretend I felt nothing, but what I felt was not asked for and did not matter. The matter had been carried over my head between the men before it ever came down to me. My father knew before I did. My mother knew before I did. Eli, I would learn much later, had gone to my father, not to me, to my father, before the courtship was anything I could have refused. I remember the spring we cut the cloth for that dress, my mother and I, in the front room with the windows open, and I thought it was only sewing. A girl is full of small thoughts on a spring afternoon. I did not know I was being measured for the rest of my life. There is a particular cruelty in that, the way they let the future come for you, dressed as an ordinary chore, so that you sew the seams of your own cage with your own hands and call it a good day's work. The light on the floorboards, the smell of the cloth, my own mother's breath at my ear, counting the inches, kind and certain and entirely sure she was doing right by me. And she was sure. I want you to hold on to that because it matters for everything that comes after. Fanny was not a hard woman by nature. She had been a girl in that same district once, measured against her own mother for her own dark dress, handed her own match by her own father, given her own single sentence of counsel, and nothing more. She was passing me exactly what had been passed to her, no less and no more, the way you pass down a recipe or a fear. The women in our world did not invent the silence. They inherited it, every one of them, and carried it, and set it on the next girl's shoulders, because their own shoulders were where it had been set. I did not understand that at 18. At 18, I only knew that my mother knew the day of my wedding before I did, and that she did not think there was anything strange in that at all. There is a word the English use now. I have heard it. Arranged. They say arranged marriage, and they think of far-off places, of strangers brought together by a broker. It was not so dramatic as that with us. No one dragged me anywhere. I was simply raised, from before I could read, to have no will of my own that a man would ever have to override, so that by the time the match was made, there was nothing left in me to ask. They did not need to force the door. They had built the house so that the door only opened one way. So I want to tell you how a girl was readied for a marriage she did not choose, because the readying is the whole of it, and the wedding night, I promised you, will only make sense once you have seen it. A plain girl was not courted the way the English court. There was no asking what I thought, no long evenings of two people learning each other. Our way ran through the fathers. A young man who had an interest spoke first to the girl's father, and if the families were agreeable, and ours were agreeable long before I was consulted, then a careful chaperoned courting was permitted, watched the whole way through. The understanding was settled above me and handed down to me, already warm, like a plate passed at the long table. I was meant to receive it with thanks. To have a feeling that ran the other way would have been hochmut, pride, and hochmut was the trap door under every plain woman's feet. A want of your own was already a kind of sin. This is the part the gentle pictures of us never show. People look at the buggy and the quilt and the lamp, and they think peace. They do not see the doctrine underneath, which we called headship, and which simply meant that authority ran downhill in a straight line, and a woman stood at the bottom of it. The man was the head of the wife, as Christ was the head of the church. That is how it was preached, drawn out slow from the front bench on a May Sunday morning. And under headship, a girl's yes was never really a yes. It could not be. A yes only means something if a no was possible. And for me, a no was never on the table. To refuse the match would have meant refusing my father, refusing the ordained men, refusing the church, refusing God Himself, all in one breath. They had bound those things together so tightly that you could not pull one loose. Gelassenheit we called the virtue, yieldedness, the surrender of your own will. It is a beautiful word in its way. It was the most beautiful chain they ever made. The only counsel I was given, in all of it, came from my mother, the morning of the wedding. Fanny was her name. She had been plain her whole life, born into the church the way I was, and she was the first enforcer I ever knew. She taught me before I could read that a question was already pride. That morning she came into the room where the dark dress hung, and she did not embrace me, and she did not weep, and she did not tell me one single thing about the life I was walking into. She straightened my collar with her 2 hands, and she looked at me, and she said one sentence, "Be yielding." That was all. Be yielding. She said it the way another woman might tell her daughter to mind the frost on the road. And then she went down to see to the celery. Be yielding. 8 years old or 18, it was the only lesson they ever finished teaching me. There was a girl in our district, I will give her one name, Mary, though that was not the whole of it, who married the same fall I did. She was barely 17. Her match had been made the same way, over her head, by the men, and she went to it the same as I went to mine, in a dark dress sewn before she was told the day. I remember her at the singings the winter before, the way the lamplight caught her face, how young she was, and I remember thinking, even then, with no words for it yet, that the 2 of us were being measured for the same thing, like 2 links of the same bolt of cloth, cut for the same plain use. We never once spoke of it to each other. There was no language between us for what was being done to us, because the language itself had been taken away before we were old enough to need it. Mary and I sat across 100 fellowship meals in the years after. Red beet eggs and church spread on the long tables of women. and we never once said the true thing out loud. The silence was not ignorance. I know that now. The silence was the only mercy the women before us knew how to pass down. If this is reaching you, stay with me. I am coming to the night now. The wedding was in the autumn, a plain Hochzeit, 2 days of it, hundreds of people, the long service and the longer day of food, roast chicken and cream celery, no rings, no music, no dancing, because we had none of those things and wanted to want none of them. I stood up before the Gmai beside a man I had spoken to in my whole life, perhaps a dozen real times, and I made my vows, and the bishop's hands were over us, and it was done. I was a wife. I was 18 years old, and I was a wife, and I had been readied for the wifely work of a farm, the canning, the garden, the wringer washer, the wood cook stove, readied for all of it for years, for the one thing no woman had readied me for at all. I had a single sentence: be yielding. I am going to tell you about that night now, and I am going to tell you the way it deserves to be told, which is plainly and without the kind of detail that would turn a true thing into a cheap one. So I will not give you the body of it. The body of it is not the horror. The horror is everything that was missing from the room. What was missing was knowledge. I went to my marriage bed, the plain bed Eli's family had built and made up in the small upstairs room of the home farm, 20 steps from where his mother Lydia slept in the Doughty house. I went to it knowing nothing. Not a word had been spoken to me by my mother, by any older woman, by the church, about what marriage asked of a woman's body. Nothing. They had measured my dress in the spring and sewn my future closed and left out the one thing a frightened girl most needed to be told. I was 18, and I did not understand what was happening to me, and there was no one in that house I was permitted to ask. And here is what I did. I have carried it 65 years. What I did was nothing. I made myself still. I made my face as smooth as the church bench, the way I would later learn to make it for 12 years under Lydia's combing. And I lay there in the dark in that plain bed, and I yielded, exactly as my mother had told me to, because yielding was the only instruction I had ever been given, and I was a good girl, and a good girl obeys. I did not cry out. I did not ask a single question. I did not say, I am frightened, or I do not understand, or please slow down. I said nothing at all. I performed the one act they had spent 18 years training into me. I disappeared. I took myself out of my own body, and I put a yielded, silent, obedient shell there in my place, and I let the night happen to the shell, and somewhere far back behind my own eyes, the actual girl I was sat very still and waited for it to be over. That is what I did on my wedding night in 1961. I obeyed a silence no one had ever explained to me. And I want you to understand, It was not done to me by a cruel man. That is the part that took me longest. Eli was as ignorant as I was. He had been handed the very same silence from the men's side of it, with no more preparation than I had, and his only instruction was to be a head over me, just as mine was to be yielded under him. 2 children, raised in the dark on purpose, put in a room together and told that this too was the will of God. He was not a monster. He was a boy holding a script he had not written either, and we both played our parts, and neither of us ever once, in 60 years of marriage, spoke of that first night again. There is a word for what that was. It is not a word we were ever allowed to use about ourselves. It took me a lifetime, 81 years, until I was off that farm and there was no one left to tell me to hush, to be able to say it out loud. And even now it comes hard. The word is consent, or rather, the absence of it. They built a girl who could not say no, married her to a boy who did not know to ask, and called the result a holy union. What I gave that night was not given. It was taken by a system through 2 children who did not know they were its instruments. That is control. Not a man's cruelty, control, the kind that does not need to raise its voice because it raised you instead. I live alone now in a rented half house on the edge of Strasbourg, a few miles from the farm where I spent 60 years. I left at 81, the year before last, after Eli was gone. The plain people who turn their buggies from me now live on the same roads, sell at the same market, and look the other way when they see me at the curb. I do not run from them. I stay, marooned inside the only world I have ever known, because running was never the thing I needed. The thing I needed was to finally tell the truth. And you do not need to leave the county to do that. You only need to stop being afraid of being heard. There is a black composition notebook I kept for nearly 40 years, hidden out in the woodshed behind the harness Eli always meant to mend, wrapped in oilcloth, written in by lamplight after he was asleep. I do not need it to remember 61. That night is written somewhere a notebook cannot reach. But I will tell you what was in that book. In among everything else, there was the girl, the one who lay still in the plain bed. I had been writing to her and as her for 40 years without ever once letting the daylight side of me know I was doing it. She was alive in there the whole time. While I poured the coffee and kept the ordnung and made my face smooth and yielded and yielded and yielded, she was out in the woodshed by lamplight, refusing to disappear. That is the only reason I am able to speak to you now. Some stubborn, hidden, unyielded part of me would not finish dying, no matter how completely I performed her death. And the truth includes this, and I will not let myself off of it. For 60 years I did not only suffer the silence, I passed it on. There was a young wife who came to my kitchen once, decades into my own marriage, with her face wet, newly married herself, frightened of the very things I had been frightened of, asking me, without quite asking, what marriage was going to require of her. And I had it in my power in that moment to tell her the truth, to be the older woman I myself had needed in that plain upstairs room in 61. I did not. I poured her a cup of ginger tea, and I put it in her 2 hands so she would have something warm to hold that was not her own fear. And I straightened her collar the way my mother had straightened mine. And I told her my mother's one sentence, "Be yielding." I handed the chain straight down, warm, the way it had been handed to me. I told myself it was kindness. It was the only kindness I knew. It was still the chain. If you grew up in a world where your future was hanging on a peg, sewn shut, before anyone told you the day, I see you. If you were taught that a want of your own was already a sin, that a question was already pride, I see you. If you ever made your face as smooth as a bench and took yourself out of your own body so you could endure the thing no one had warned you of, I see you. And if you ever, in your own turn, handed the silence down to a younger woman because it was the only thing your hands knew how to give, I see you most of all, because I am her, and there is grace even there, but only if you finally turn and look at it. I cannot get back the girl who lay still in that bed in 1961. But I found her again, late, and she had been in there the whole time, waiting. They put the dress on me before I knew I had a self to cover, and it took me a lifetime to find her again, and she was still in there the whole time, waiting. That is the only thing I have to give you that is worth the giving. Not advice, just this. Someone lived a whole life inside the silence and lived to name it, and the naming did not kill her. It set her down at last in her own body, in her own house, in her own quiet at 83. The chain ends with whoever decides it ends. Let it be you.